are mostly flat bones, right?
Okay.
Flat bones that ossify by intermembranous ossification. So there's a membrane on top, a membrane on bottom, and there's like cartilage and other connective tissues in between, and they're like seed spots where it starts ossifying, and then those ossification centers kind of expand until the whole thing is a bone.
Okay.
The joints between the flat bones of the skull are called sutures. Occasionally, inside of a suture, you might find a tiny little bone, maybe the size of a grain of sand, which is another sesamoid bone. If there's a bone inside of a joint, and suture is a type of a joint, you are going to call it a sesamoid bone. So this is the frontal bone. There are two parietal bones. There's an occipital bone, which goes all the way here, and it has a big hole here through which the spinal cord is passing through. These on the sides are temporal bones. Remember that as a temple, right? Temporal bone has a zygomatic process because it's going towards the zygomatic bone. This is the zygomatic bone, which has a temporal process because it's a road towards temporal bone. So zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, they fuse together. You see there's a suture there. And this structure is called zygomatic arch. This is what you feel right here under your eye.
Okay.
All right. This part here is the sphenoid that you can see from the outside. This thing here, 9, that has a little hole. In some other skulls you can actually see a hole. That is the hole for the tear gland, for the duct of the tear gland. So this is a tear bone, which means lacrimal bone. That's the word for it. The lacrimal bone is this number 9. These two skinny bones on top here are nasal bones. They make the base of the nose. Most of the rest of the nose is going to be made of cartilage.
Okay.
Upper jaw is called maxilla. So that's it here, maxilla. If you look inside of the nose, you're going to see these ridges, and those are the turbinate processes of the ethmoid bone. They're making the ridges to ensure that the air that comes in a kind of a smooth flow gets into the turbulent flow. So all the dust and dirt and viruses, instead of going straight into the lungs, they start kind of hitting the walls of the nasal cavity, get stuck in the mucus that's produced by the goblet cells of the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, which is lining the respiratory tract. Okay, the lower jaw is called the mandible, and I'm not going to ask about various details of it. So let's open up this skull to look from the top down. So here's the brain sitting on all of this, right?
Okay.
Okay, so the important parts that I'm going to ask are two. Remember how we mentioned that this little part is the sphenoid bone? Actually, this one here is sphenoid bone. Well, sphenoid bone is all of this that looks like a butterfly, and we have in a separate box loose just sphenoid bone. And if you take it out, it looks like a butterfly. It looks fragile. I can ask it just like, what is this? And you tell me sphenoid bone. It's going to be on a desk, right? But what is important about a sphenoid bone is that it has this structure in the middle. This structure in the middle is enclosing something from 5 sides. See, there's bone in front, bone on the side, bone on the side, bone on the bottom, and bone in the back. Only on the top there's no bone because there's brain there. And the structure that's inside of this in here in this hall, like kind of boxed in by bone, is the pituitary gland, a very, very important part of the brain, a very important part of the endocrine system. It's very hard to access it if you have to do surgery on the pituitary because it's bone on 5 sides. This structure, the bone structure, is called sella turcica because whoever anatomist first described it thought that it looked like a Turkish saddle. So, Ottoman Empire was all over Europe, and they were, coming in on horses, and they had this saddle with that kind of a typical shape. So this is sella turcica, or Turkish saddle, which is part of the sphenoid bone. When you go a little forward, rostrally, towards the nose, this part here is the top part of the ethmoid bone. This is the only part of the ethmoid bone that we can see from the top. And there's a thin, pretty tall ridge in the middle, and that's called crista galli. And crista galli means a rooster's comb, right? Because again, some anatomists thought it looked like a rooster's comb. You know, that was centuries ago. People lived, you know, out where they had chickens.
And this is which number?
And that is number 5. And then on each side of the crista galli is a very, very thin piece of the ethmoid bone, which is called cribriform plate.
This one, right?
Yes, and cribriform plate, if you look carefully, has lots of little holes. If you pull out a different skull, this is a plastic skull. If you pull a real skull from the real skeleton, you're going to actually see holes. They're going through. You can see light passing through them.
Okay.
And what passes through those holes are the axons, or the processes of the olfactory nerves. Olfactory nerves are going to have their bodies in the nasal cavity, right? And they're going to have the olfactory receptors on the surfaces, so they're going to capture various molecules from the air and register those as smell. They're going to have to send that information to the brain for processing, so the brain is conscious that you're smelling a rose or a hog farm or whatever, you know, bathroom, whatever, you know, is the smell. And so these processes have to go through the holes in the cribriform plate. Right on top of the cribriform plate is the brain, and it's the part of the brain that's called olfactory bulbs, which are processing the sense of smell.
Okay.
You can